Okay, good afternoon, Year 12. Before we start today's lesson properly, where we're going to actually be looking at the effect your attachment type as an infant has on later relationships and later life, I wanted to provide just a little bit of feedback on some of the exam questions that I asked you to do following the previous lesson. So thank you to those of you who have sent that through. If you haven't yet done so, it's not too late. Just email me. You can see here some people have just handwritten it and sent a photo through. Other people have done it electronically and just emailed or shared a file. So either is absolutely fine, but I would like to be able to provide you with some feedback as well. So a couple of examples here. We've got one from Kelsey, and she provided, that's on the left hand side of the screen, she provided a lovely, really succinct summary at the start of her answer. So that's where she's getting her AO1, her knowledge marks in. She clearly had the Van Isgendum study in mind, which is what I would expect you to have, because this was a cultural variations question, and that set her up lovely to then discuss the findings, almost in that bullet point approach, which is fine on an 8-mark question. She then goes on to give really excellent range of supporting evidence, so not just relying on the Van Isgendum study, but referring to other people in there, like the Kennedy and Bakeman study, and giving specific statistics as well, which really impresses the examiner. A number of you emailed through and sort of were asking, how would I structure an 8-mark question? We've done 8-mark questions before, but not really focused around a particular piece of research. So at the bottom of your screen there, you can see that I'm suggesting with an 8-mark question, as soon as we see that word discuss, we know we've got marks for knowledge and we've got marks for evaluation, and it will be an even split. So we're going to have 4 marks for our knowledge and 4 marks for our evaluation. So it's reasonable to expect that you would have 2 clear paragraphs, an AO1 paragraph which needs to have quite a bit of depth and detail to it, and an AO3, our evaluation paragraph, where we're using all of those issues and debates that we started to think about. So for example, is it socially sensitive research? Is it suggesting something about parenting that might cause distress? Are the sample sizes large enough? Or in this instance, where we're looking at cultural variation and we're looking at using the strange situation in different cultures, is it an imposed ethic? Remember, that question came up in our retrieval last lesson. And to demonstrate how you might think about structuring that, I've taken a little snapshot from Bethany's answer, which was great, where she's got a really nice AO1 paragraph there. So if you're looking at your answer and you haven't yet got the feedback from me, what I'd like you to do is just reflect on it and think, have I got my AO1 in there? Have I got enough detail? Have I got AO3? And if you haven't yet incorporated that discuss element, the evaluation, then have a go at doing that. Remember, we use our door frame, our evaluation toolkit, to help prompt our thinking on that. But so far, the kind of quality of work that's been coming through has been great. I know I asked you to look at a couple of other questions as well. So you'll see on the next slide just a snapshot of the mark scheme for those exam questions to allow you to self-mark some of the shorter ones. So here are the answers for the other questions. This is just taken directly from the mark scheme. So you can self-mark your own answers to the multiple choice, obviously, very easily. If you did make a mistake, go back to it and look at it and think about why. Were you getting your type A and your type C attachments muddled up, or did you just miss a clue in the wording? Particularly number 13, the difference within cultures and between cultures, making sure you're clear on that intra and inter that we looked at last lesson. So just you can self-mark your own and green pen those, and then you can see that for the longer questions, the 8-marker here, I've just included the possible content and the same for the 4-marker. And you'll see how repetitive this is. Now, obviously, normally in an exam, you wouldn't get both an 8-marker and a 4-marker on the same piece of research like this. But what I want you to see, well, a couple of things. I want you to practice it repeatedly and rehearsing that knowledge. But also, I want you to see that once you've learned those few key findings for a major study, like this Van Isgendum study, then as long as you're able to apply it, whatever context they give you, whatever mark question they might throw at you, then you're ready. And we know that those studies that are on the spec, like Van Isgendorm, like Ainsworth, like Harlow, the ones that are really clearly identified in your knowledge organiser, we know we have to know them inside out, which is why I keep encouraging you, and if you haven't done so yet, create key cards for those studies where you're identifying the aim, what the procedure was, what the findings were, the conclusion from that, and the evaluation, you know, what was wrong with it. All of those evaluative points that are going to help us if we get an 8 mark or even a 16 mark where we're expected to discuss and evaluate. So for your retrieval today, I'd like you to have a go at this. We've done one like this before, so it should be pretty straightforward. Give yourself no more than 5 minutes. Obviously, don't use your notes. If you have got a printer at home, I think it would be ideal if you could print it out and then just fill it in with your retrieving your knowledge. But if you haven't got a printer, don't worry. Either scribble down your thoughts on a piece of paper or even just do it aloud to yourself so that you can see where your gaps are. Okay, so if you could complete your retrieval task, we'll review the answers in 5 minutes. Here we go again, so it's the yellow boxes we're looking at. So hopefully you knew that the meta-analysis was Van Isgendorm, probably a variety of different spellings of that, but as long as we're close enough for this purpose. Mary Ainsworth, of course, designed The Strange Situation. Remember, she was a student of Bowlby, so very heavily influenced by his ideas, and it was Schafer and Emerson who identified the stages of attachment. So that's going back to the beginning of the topic. You had to spot your mistakes. A couple of these I've used before, so I've purposely thrown them back in to see whether you picked up on it this time. So the first mistake, it's not classical conditioning, it would be operant conditioning. That would explain that, because that's the idea of there being a reinforcement. It's type C children that would be really resistant towards their primary caregiver at the reunion stage. Remember, we remember it by thinking C for clingy. So type C children, at first we see them being really, really clingy to their parents, inconsolable when the parent leaves the room. You know, it's as though the world has ended. But then when the parent comes back in, they resist them, they're angry at them, and often that resistance lasts quite a while. The next one, the higher proportion, in Germany it would be type A that we would see, insecure avoidant, and we think that's because, we talked about this in lesson, we think it's because there's a more independent style of parenting that's encouraged, so we're more likely to see type A behaviours. It's not true that the Van Isgendorm study has a small sample size. When you add up all of the findings in that meta-analysis, you're looking at large numbers of mother-infant pairings. How we can criticise it, though, and evaluate it is that the sample sizes in each culture varied, and that made it quite inconsistent to draw conclusions. Now, with The Strange Situation, we can criticise it in lots of ways, but what we cannot say is that it lacks reliability, because actually The Strange Situation is a highly controlled observation. Whenever you highly control something, it's usually high in reliability. Remember, the way we remember reliability is that we can repeat it and get the same results. So The Strange Situation is actually quite high in reliability. What it's lacking in is validity, and especially ecological validity. So when we make the point that it's in a false environment, we can say it lacks ecological validity, because how you would behave with a primary caregiver in a lab setting or a room in the basement of a university is very different to how a child would react in their own home, surrounded by their own toys, where they feel much more safe and secure. For our Give Me 3, that should be quite straightforward. Remember, for Bowlby's evolutionary theory, we're using our SMACI acronym to help remember the key features. I just picked 3 of them, you might have picked others. And when it comes to evaluating or identifying the problems with The Strange Situation, lacks that ecological validity, socially sensitive, and we could argue it's unethical because of the high levels of distress it causes for those type C children. Now, on the other hand, I wanted you to think about and present some alternative arguments to this idea that the attachment type of a child that we might see in The Strange Situation is entirely due to parenting. And hopefully you remembered that discussion that we had about actually some children just having a different temperament, being particularly moody, and actually it doesn't necessarily suggest an insecure attachment if on one occasion we've witnessed kind of clingy or avoidant behaviours. So we need to think about the temperament of the child, we need to think about the time of day, were they tired, had something just happened, had they lost their favourite toy. All of these things will actually, in the real world, make quite a big difference to what we would witness when carrying out the strange situation. And as psychologists, we mustn't forget that when we're looking at this data. Okay, so what I'd like you to do on just a slip of paper is quickly retrieve your knowledge. So when we're thinking about Bowlby's evolutionary theory, what are the 5 elements? So what are the different parts of SMACI as we remember it? Quickly scribble those down for me, please. You have 30 seconds. Last 5 seconds. Okay, so you should have had social releases, monotrophy, adaptive, critical period, and internal working model. And the reason I wanted you to retrieve your knowledge on that, going back to our Bowlby evolutionary theory of why attachments form, is because this bit about the internal working model is going to be really important for us in what we're moving on to think about now. You remember when we looked at the case of baby P and we did a little bit of background reading about that tragic case, and we found it was like a cycle of not only abuse and neglect but poor quality attachments that went back through the mother, the father, the grandparents. Well, Bowlby thought, and many other psychologists too, including Mary Ainsworth, that that's not an unfortunate coincidence, that your earliest attachment forms that blueprint, that internal working model that you keep going back to when you're forming your own attachments with your own children, but also other relationships as well. Because remember, an attachment is just a reciprocal emotional bond. So that can apply to adult relationships as well, where you're attached to your marital partner or whatever it might be. So this idea of the internal working model is absolutely critical when we're thinking about how your early attachment types affect things in your later life. Things like how satisfied and happy you are in your marriage, and things like your mental health and how resilient you are to loss and to mourning. And we're going to look at a number of pieces of research, and the sheet that I sent through on the Sims engagement tool is a bit of a summary of some of those key pieces of research. And we're going to think about what this tells us about our attachment type and the impact that it has on our later life. Okay, so just to give a little bit of context to see where this all fits in, and this is just a snapshot taken from your booklets that you've got, which have got all the retrieval questions in, the past exam questions for the attachment topic. The bit that we're thinking about here is down here at the bottom. That's a terrible circle, isn't it? Early attachment and the effect on adult relationships. So that's the bit that we're thinking about. You've also got a section in your knowledge organizer that relates to this. So as you're revisiting it, creating flashcards, rehearsing it, tick it off on your list and rate how confident you're feeling with it. So on your knowledge organizer, you can see the top right hand side there, that's your kind of link to what we're looking at here. Now obviously all that is a prompt. You're going to need to make sure you're looking at that alongside your additional notes, the page in the textbook, which I've provided you the link for, and just using that really to identify the key flashcards that you might need. So the Hazen and Javer love quiz, you might have a flashcard on that. The McCarthy research, what that tells us, Cohen and Ward. So that is just literally a kind of a flashpoint for you to think, okay, that's what I need to make sure I'm confident on. Okay, so a bit of reading for you to do. This is what I sent through on Sims engagement, and that is essentially a summary of lots of different pieces of research that have been done around this idea of how does our early attachment type with our parents or our primary caregivers then impact us in later life. And there's some really interesting pieces of research in there. Some of the most important ones, which you'd be expected to be familiar with to approach exam questions on this, are the Hazen and Shaver. That's the first one on there, and theirs is often commonly known as the love quiz. But essentially what they did was they conducted this study to collect, first of all, a picture of what the people's early attachment type was, so getting them to reflect back on their relationships with their parents. We know that's going to have problems. Asking anybody to reflect back is never going to be the most reliable of data. And they also wanted to look at their current relationships, so they gave them a sort of love quiz, if you like, which asked them questions about their own current relationship, and how secure they were in that, and how comfortable they were with intimacy and in forming new relationships and those sorts of things. And what they found was there's a correlation, and we find this in a lot of these pieces of research. There was a correlation between how securely attached you were as an infant, so that type B attachment coming through, and how comfortable and secure you are in your adult relationships. And other research supports that. So, for example, McCarthy did a similar study looking at marital satisfaction and found you were much more likely to be satisfied in your marriage if you were as securely attached as an infant. And the more you read, the more a picture it paints that actually your whole life really is determined by your attachment type as a child. Ward's research tells us we're more likely to have mental health problems if we had an insecure attachment as an infant. We are more likely to struggle with the loss of loved ones, Cohen says, if we've had an insecure attachment as an infant. So we're less likely to be resilient to the problems that life will throw at us. And all of these pieces of research support what Bowlby said about the internal working model. And they also support this idea of the continuity hypothesis. This is a really important phrase for you to learn. And it's, as the name suggests, continuity, it continues. It's still a hypothesis because there's not enough evidence to make it anything other than a hypothesis. But the continuity hypothesis tells us that the attachment type that we have as an infant continues with us and shapes our later life and our later relationships and our resilience and all of these other things. As a piece of research that might be particularly of interest to you guys, just because of the stage of your life that you're at, and that's the last one on your summary sheet there, and that's Bernier, and they looked at young people like yourselves that would just be going off to university, and how well those people were able to cope at university, depending on their attachment type as an infant. So for those children that would have been type A as infants, that insecure avoidant, they found that actually they didn't have any problem at all moving away from home in terms of going off to university. But for type C children, those that moved away from university, they found it very hard. And actually there was a sharp decline in the quality of the relationship with their parents. So when they were coming back home from university to visit, the relationships started to break down. There started to be more conflict. Now, that particular study only looked at 62 college students, small sample, but very socially sensitive. And I'm sure just listening to that, some of you will be thinking, oh my God, I wonder what attachment type I am. Does that mean I'm not going to cope when I move away to university? Of course it doesn't. And this is the thing. This is socially sensitive research. It kind of does invoke that sort of response in people, and it's not conclusive. Small sample sizes, often almost anecdotal evidence, and it can't possibly be that. That's why we say this is still a hypothesis. But definitely worth thinking about when you put all of that evidence together, and it has had implications. You know how we often in psychology we have to think about, right, so what? This research has been done, so what? What's it led to? Well, this kind of research has led us to think about the importance of early attachment, and if there is an insecure attachment that's formed for whatever reason, intervening and kind of almost trying to put things in place and stop it in its tracks before history repeats itself. I'm going to remind you of that tragic case of baby P that we looked at. There needed to be some kind of intervention long before baby P had even come into this world, where those insecure, unstable attachments, harmful attachments, were forming that blueprint, that internal working model. So a couple of things for you guys to do. Make sure you read through those notes properly and turn it into flashcards. Create your key name cards. Make sure you're confident in what the continuity hypothesis is. That would be another good flashcard based around that key piece of vocab. And in your online textbook that you've obviously all got access to, page 92 and 93 is essentially the bit that you need to be looking at for this. So there's some nice summary notes in there and a couple of activities that you could have a go at to apply your knowledge. Okay, so having read through all of that, hopefully you're feeling confident you've got a range of pieces of research at your disposal. Obviously, they need committing to memory, and that's going to take a little bit of time. You need to keep checking yourself against your flashcards that you've created. I wouldn't recommend learning all of them. It's not necessary. I would say 3 or 4 key pieces that look at the different effects on later life. So if you did the Cohen research that linked to dealing with loss, McCarthy or Hazer and Shaver, whichever you prefer, regarding kind of marital satisfaction and love in later relationships, and maybe a piece of research that links to bullying or how people cope when they have to move away from home. So 3 or 4 key pieces. Once you're confident with all of that, the only final task I'd like you to do for today, and this may be more as a going away and coming back to it task, is just a few exam style questions again. So we've got 3 here, and these aren't in your packs, so I'm going to try and mix up so you're not always using exam questions for from your pack, so we're saving those for later revision as well. So these are additional ones that I've sourced. So we've got an outline question just for 3 marks. We've got a link between early attachment and childhood relationships, so make sure you're focusing in on the right thing there. And then we've got a bit of an application question where we've got Oz and Veruca. What a name. Anyway, so that's a 4-mark one. I can see the way these questions are getting you thinking. They're hinting at you that this is very much about the internal working model, that key feature of Bowlby's theory. So I'd like you to have a go at those questions. Again, you can either type them and send them through, or you can handwrite them and just send me a photo, and I'll try and collate some of the answers that I get into some feedback at the start of next lesson. Okay, we will be kind of reviewing this next week, so keep using your flashcards, use that knowledge organizer, and I'll see how much of it is stuck next time when we meet or not meet. Okay, thanks guys, have a good few days.